You think African American breakfast tables in the 1970s looked like everyone else's? Think again. These morning meals weren't about trends. They were about stretching pennies and turning almost nothing into something that stuck to your ribs. Here are 30 breakfasts that proved your family knew how to survive. Cornmeal mush with bacon grease was the breakfast that kept black children fed when the cupboard held almost nothing else. Mothers stirred coarse cornmeal into boiling water, cooking it slow until it thickened into dense porridge that could fill the hungriest belly. The bacon grease added precious calories and richness that plain mush couldn't provide. Families saved every drop of rendered fat in coffee cans beside the stove, knowing it would stretch meals through the week. Children ate it hot from chip bowls, sometimes with salt or a drizzle of sorghum. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and filling. This breakfast taught children that resourcefulness meant never wasting anything, not even yesterday's cooking fat. The taste carried memories of wood stoves and mothers who made miracles from almost nothing. Potlikker and cornbread was breakfast born from last night's greens, the rich broth saved because throwing it away meant wasting nourishment itself. After collards simmered all day with ham hocks, the liquid left behind was dark, salty, and packed with vitamins that poor families desperately needed. Mothers heated it up and served it with crumbled cornbread soaking in the middle. Children sipped it like soup, the cornbread dissolving into something soft and savory that warmed them inside out. This wasn't just thrift, but wisdom, stretching one pot of greens into 2 meals when money was scarce. The broth carried iron from the greens and flavor from the pork. Families believed it gave strength for the day ahead. Potlikker breakfast was proof that nothing in a poor kitchen ever went to waste. Fried salt pork and gravy was the breakfast that made something substantial from the cheapest cuts the butcher offered. Salt pork, preserved in brine and packed with fat, could be sliced thin and fried until the edges crisped and the fat rendered into the pan. That rendered fat became the base for gravy, thickened with flour and stretched with water or milk. Poured over biscuits, the gravy turned a few slices of pork into a meal that fed a whole table. The meat was chewy and intensely salty, a flavor children learned to tolerate because there wasn't anything else. This breakfast represented poverty's reality where fresh bacon was too expensive. The gravy smoothed the salt and made everything feel richer. Salt pork gravy was poor food that refused to apologize. Sugar bread was the breakfast treat that cost almost nothing but made children feel special. A slice of white bread was spread with butter or margarine, then sprinkled with white sugar until it sparkled. Sometimes it was eaten cold, the sugar crunching with every bite. Other times, mothers toasted it under the broiler until the sugar melted into a thin, caramelized crust. Either way, it was sweet and satisfying, a moment of joy for children who didn't have candy or store-bought treats. The cost was pennies, but the happiness was real. Sugar bread appeared in lunch boxes and on breakfast plates when that's all there was. It was poor kid food that felt like indulgence, turning plain bread into something worth anticipating. This breakfast reminded children that sweetness didn't require money. Grits with Redeye gravy was breakfast for families who stretched country ham until every bit of flavor was extracted. After frying thin slices of salty ham, mothers would deglaze the pan with black coffee, creating thin gravy that was dark with a reddish tint. That gravy was poured over hot grits, turning plain corn into something deeply savory. The coffee added bitterness that cut through the salt and fat, creating flavors that woke you up as well as any morning coffee could. Children learned to eat it because that's what was served, though many came to crave its strange, compelling taste. Redeye gravy was Southern tradition born from necessity. The grits underneath soaked up everything, becoming rich with each spoonful. This was proof that poverty could produce complex flavors. Molasses and biscuits was the breakfast black children ate when butter was too dear and jam was luxury. Biscuits came from the oven, hot and steaming, split open with fingers, their soft insides waiting to soak up whatever sweetness was available. Molasses, thick and dark, was drizzled from jars that sat on every poor family's table because it cost less than sugar. The flavor was earthy and deeply sweet, almost smoky, coating the tongue with richness that white sugar never matched. Children poked holes in their biscuits and watched the molasses pool before each bite. It was simple food carrying centuries of tradition. Molasses provided iron that growing children needed. This wasn't dessert, but breakfast, a reminder that poverty didn't mean going without something sweet. Fried fatback and eggs was breakfast that proved even the cheapest meat could anchor a morning meal. Fatback, pure pork fat, sliced from the pig's back, was what poor families bought when bacon was beyond reach. Sliced thin and fried, slow in cast iron, it rendered into crispy strips, swimming in grease while filling the kitchen with a smell that announced breakfast was serious. The eggs came next, fried in that fat until their edges lace brown, the yolk still soft. Together they made a plate that was rich, salty, and filling enough to carry anyone through until lunch. Fatback had no meat, just pure fat providing calories and flavor. It was what the poor could afford, the part wealthier families didn't want. This breakfast was survival food that refused to pretend otherwise. Leftover rice with milk and sugar was breakfast that turned last night's side dish into this morning's meal. Cold rice was spooned into bowls, covered with milk and sprinkled with sugar until it became something like cereal, but heartier. Children ate it cold in summer or warmed gently in winter, the rice softening until each spoonful was creamy and sweet. It was breakfast that only happened in houses where food couldn't be wasted, where yesterday's dinner became tomorrow's meal without question. The sugar transformed plain rice into a treat, and milk added the calcium growing children needed. Families with nothing but rice could still serve breakfast, stretching one ingredient across 2 meals. This taught children that resourcefulness meant seeing possibility instead of scraps. Sardines and crackers was breakfast that came from tins when there was no time or money for anything else. The small silver fish, packed in oil or mustard sauce, were cheap and shelf-stable, sitting in pantries for weeks. Mothers would pop open the can and serve sardines on saltine crackers, sometimes mashing them with a fork and adding hot sauce. Children ate them with fingers, the salty fish and crunchy crackers, making a meal surprisingly filling and rich with protein. It wasn't what anyone would choose if choices were abundant, but it was what poor families could afford. The smell was strong and unmistakable, filling kitchens with the scent of poverty and the sea. But sardines provided nutrients children needed. This was poor people's food that kept families fed when nothing else was available. Water gravy and toast was the breakfast that happened when milk ran out and there was no money for more. Mothers made gravy from flour, water, and fat, seasoning it with salt and pepper until it resembled the milk gravy wealthier families enjoyed. Poured over toast or biscuits, it was filling even if it wasn't rich, providing carbohydrates and calories. Children ate it without complaint because they knew this was what the house could offer. The gravy was thin compared to its milk-based cousin, but it stuck to bread and filled stomachs just the same. This was Depression-era cooking that never fully disappeared from black kitchens. Water gravy represented the absolute minimum, breakfast when everything else was gone. It was proof that even with nearly nothing, a mother could put something hot on the table. Canned mackerel cakes were breakfast when money couldn't stretch to fresh fish or even canned salmon. The fish came packed in water or oil, mashed with whatever binder was available, usually cracker crumbs or leftover cornbread. Mothers shaped the mixture into patties and fried them until both sides turned golden and crispy. The flavor was strong and fishy, but it was protein poor families could afford when meat prices climbed too high. Children learned to eat mackerel cakes with hot sauce to mask the intensity, though many grew to love that briny taste. These cakes stretched a single can into breakfast for an entire family when served with grits. The smell announced itself through the whole house. Mackerel cakes represented making do, turning cheap canned fish into something filling and satisfying. Fried cornmeal mush was yesterday's breakfast, reborn into something new the next morning. Leftover mush was poured into a loaf pan and refrigerated until firm enough to slice. Those thick slabs were fried in bacon grease until the outside turned crispy and golden while the inside stayed soft and creamy. Drizzled with syrup or molasses, it became breakfast that felt almost like a treat despite costing nearly nothing. The crispy exterior gave way to smooth, warm mush that melted on the tongue. This was 2 meals from 1 pot of cornmeal, stretching resources in ways only poor families truly understood. Children often preferred the fried version to the original, asking for extra slices. The transformation showed how creativity could make poverty food exciting. Fried mush was proof that leftovers could become something worth anticipating. Peanut butter and syrup was breakfast that stuck to the roof of your mouth and stayed with you all morning. A thick smear of peanut butter on bread was drizzled with pancake syrup, creating a combination that was sticky, sweet, and rich with protein. The peanut butter provided nutrients growing children needed, while the syrup made it feel like a treat rather than survival food. Families kept both ingredients on hand because they were cheap and lasted weeks without spoiling. The mixture was sometimes stirred together into a paste before spreading. This breakfast appeared on tables across poor Black neighborhoods, a reliable source of calories when fresh food wasn't available. The sweetness balanced the dense richness of peanut butter perfectly. It was filling, affordable, and children actually looked forward to eating it. Hoe cakes with Strico lean was country breakfast that told the world your family had rural roots and empty pockets. Hoe cakes were simple cornmeal flatbreads cooked on a greased griddle until golden, edges crispy and centers dense. Strico lean, the fattiest and cheapest pork available, was sliced thin and fried until some parts crisped while others stayed chewy. Together they made a plate that was salty, filling, and heavy enough to fuel a morning of hard work. The pork fat dripped onto the hoe cakes, flavoring them without needing butter. This was breakfast from slavery times that survived because poor families still needed cheap food that satisfied. Children grew up eating hoe cakes without knowing their history. The combination represented both heritage and hardship, food that refused to disappear because people still needed it. Cold biscuits and sorghum was breakfast when there wasn't time or fuel to heat anything up. Yesterday's biscuits, stored in a cloth-covered bowl, were split open and drizzled with thick sorghum syrup. The biscuits weren't soft anymore, but still edible, their dense texture soaking up the dark sweetness. This was breakfast, eaten standing at the counter or walking out the door, a meal for mornings when work couldn't wait. Sorghum was cheaper than store-bought syrup and carried a deeper, almost smoky sweetness that defined Southern poverty cooking. Children learned to appreciate cold biscuits because complaining meant going without. The combination was simple but sustaining, carbohydrates and sugar to fuel whatever the day demanded. Cold biscuit breakfast showed that poor families didn't always have hot meals. Commodity cheese grits was breakfast made possible by government surplus food distributed in poor black neighborhoods. The cheese came in plain cardboard boxes, processed and orange, meant to help families who couldn't afford groceries. Melted into hot grits, it transformed plain corn into something creamy, rich, and satisfying. Children didn't know the cheese was charity. They just knew it tasted good, stirred into their morning bowl. The cheese melted smooth and coated every grain with flavor that store-bought cheese couldn't match at that price. Families learned to make commodity cheese stretch, using it in grits and sandwiches. This breakfast represented both the shame and salvation of government assistance. Commodity cheese grits tasted like survival with dignity, proof that help could become something worth eating. Tomato gravy and rice was breakfast that stretched a can of tomatoes into a meal for the whole family. The gravy was made by cooking canned tomatoes with flour, fat, and seasonings until it thickened into something between sauce and stew. Poured over hot rice, it became filling breakfast that provided carbohydrates and vitamins when money couldn't buy meat or eggs. The flavor was tangy and slightly sweet, with tomatoes softening into the gravy until everything blended. Children ate it with spoons, the rice soaking up every bit of red sauce in the bowl. This wasn't traditional breakfast, but poor families ate what they had rather than what convention demanded. Tomato gravy showed up on tables throughout the South, turning pantry staples into real meals. The dish proved breakfast could be whatever filled the belly. Cracklin bread was breakfast that used every bit of the hog, including the crispy bits left after rendering lard. Cracklins, those crunchy pieces of fried pork skin and fat, were folded into cornbread batter before baking. The result was cornbread studded with pockets of salty, chewy richness that made plain bread into something special. Children searched for the crackling pieces in their slices, savoring each bite of crispy pork among the cornmeal. This bread required nothing extra on top because the fat was already baked inside. Families who raised their own hogs had cracklins available after butchering, and nothing was ever wasted. The bread came from the oven fragrant and golden. This was poverty food that tasted like abundance, turning scraps into something worth anticipating. Cracklin bread carried heritage in every bite. Streak-o-lean and biscuits was breakfast poor families ate when bacon was a luxury they couldn't afford. Streak-o-lean, that fatty strip of pork with barely any meat, cost a fraction of bacon's price. Sliced thin and fried slow, it rendered out fat while developing crispy edges and chewy centers that were intensely salty. The fat collected in the pan was saved for cooking or poured over the biscuits. Children learned to eat streak-o-lean without complaint, knowing it was this or nothing some mornings. The meat wasn't pretty, but it filled bellies and provided calories growing bodies needed. Biscuits soaked up the grease and became richer for it. This breakfast was poverty visible on a plate, the kind of food people ate when money determined every meal. Streak-o-lean meant doing without while still doing enough. Oatmeal with lard was breakfast when butter was too expensive and the oats needed something to make them palatable. A spoonful of lard stirred into hot oatmeal melted into the grain, adding richness and calories that plain oatmeal couldn't provide. The taste was savory rather than sweet, unfamiliar to anyone who grew up with sugar and milk on their porridge. But for poor families, lard was what they had, rendered from hogs or bought cheap. Children ate it because that's what was served, learning early that breakfast wasn't always about pleasure. The oatmeal became silky with the fat, coating the tongue in ways water alone never could. This was fuel for the body, not comfort for the soul. Oatmeal with lard represented poor families using whatever fat was available to stretch meals. Kushkush was Creole breakfast that found its way into poor black kitchens across Louisiana and beyond. Cornmeal was fried in a skillet with a little fat, stirred and broken apart until it formed small crumbles that were crispy on edges and soft inside. Milk or cane syrup was poured over the top, turning the fried cornmeal into something like hot cereal, but with more texture. The dish required nothing but cornmeal and fat, making it perfect for families who couldn't afford store-bought cereals. Children loved the crunch mixed with sweetness, eating it quickly before the milk made everything soggy. Kushkush was simple and ancient, breakfast connecting black families to French Louisiana heritage. It was peasant food that tasted better than it had any right to. This breakfast proved that cornmeal could become almost anything. Liver pudding and grits was breakfast that made use of organ meat, ground and seasoned into loaves that could be sliced and fried. The pudding was dense and rich, made from pork liver mixed with cornmeal and spices, then cooked until firm enough to slice. Fried in a hot skillet, it developed crispy edges while staying soft and almost creamy inside. Served alongside grits, it made a plate that was heavy with iron and protein. The flavor was strong and distinctly livery, not for everyone but beloved by those who grew up eating it. Poor families valued liver pudding because it cost less than regular meat and provided nutrition children needed. The smell of it frying announced breakfast throughout the house. This was country food that survived in cities because poor folks brought their recipes north during the Great Migration. Hogmaw hash was breakfast made from pig stomach that had been cleaned, boiled, and chopped into a skillet with potatoes and onions. The texture was chewy and unfamiliar to anyone who hadn't grown up eating offal, but the flavor was mild and absorbed whatever seasonings were added. Families who butchered their own hogs used every part, and hogmaw was too substantial to waste. Fried until the potatoes crisped and the maw pieces browned, it became a hearty plate that could carry a person through hours of work. Children either loved it or learned to tolerate it, knowing this was what the family could afford. The dish represented nose-to-tail eating long before that phrase became fashionable. Hogmaw hash was survival food that stretched one animal into many meals. It was poor people's breakfast that refused to apologize for what it was. Blackstrap molasses milk was breakfast drink that gave children iron and energy when solid food wasn't available. A spoonful of thick, dark blackstrap molasses was stirred into milk until it turned tan and tasted of bittersweet minerals. The molasses was cheap and nutritious, packed with iron that growing children needed and calories that helped them focus through school. It wasn't delicious by any standard, blackstrap being far more bitter than regular molasses, but it was what poor families could provide. Children drank it quickly to get it over with, knowing the taste would linger. This breakfast drink appeared in households where money was so tight that a glass of fortified milk counted as a meal. Blackstrap molasses milk represented doing whatever it took to keep children nourished when the pantry was nearly bare. Fried bologna and eggs was breakfast when real bacon or sausage was beyond the family's reach. Bologna, that cheap processed meat sold in plastic packages, was sliced thick and fried until the edges curled up and the center puffed. The meat turned crispy outside while staying soft inside, developing flavor that was salty and slightly sweet from caramelization. Eggs were cracked into the same greasy pan, frying in bologna drippings until whites set and edges laced brown. Together, they made a plate that was filling and familiar, breakfast that children actually wanted to eat. Bologna cost a fraction of bacon's price and lasted longer in the refrigerator. This was working-class breakfast that showed up on tables across Black neighborhoods. It was poor people's food that tasted good enough to become comfort. Flour, gravy, and biscuits was breakfast, stripped down to its barest essentials when meat wasn't available. The gravy was made from nothing but flour, water, fat, salt, and pepper, cooked until it thickened into something resembling milk gravy without the milk. Poured over split biscuits, it provided carbohydrates and fat to start the day when that's all the kitchen could offer. The taste was plain, almost bland, saved only by salt and pepper doing heavy lifting. Children ate it because there wasn't anything else, learning early that breakfast meant fuel. This was the breakfast of last resort, what mothers made when cupboards held nothing but flour and lard. Flour gravy represented poverty at its most honest. It filled bellies, even if it couldn't fill hearts, proof that survival sometimes meant eating what you had. Cornbread, crumbled in buttermilk, was breakfast that turned yesterday's bread into this morning's meal. Cold cornbread was broken into chunks and dropped into a glass of cold buttermilk until it softened into something like thick, tangy porridge. The combination was eaten with a spoon, cornbread absorbing the buttermilk's sourness while holding some texture. It was cheap, fast, and required no cooking, perfect for mornings when time and fuel couldn't be spared. Children either loved the tangy combination or forced it down knowing this was what breakfast meant that day. The dish was common across the rural South where buttermilk was plentiful and cornbread always on hand. It provided calcium and carbohydrates, enough substance to last through morning chores. This breakfast connected Black families to traditions stretching back generations. Fried salt herring was breakfast that came from barrels and wooden boxes, the fish preserved in salt until needed. The herring had to be soaked overnight to remove excess salt, then fried in a hot skillet until the skin crisped and the flesh turned flaky and tender. The flavor was intensely briny and fishy, not delicate, but rich with protein that poor families couldn't find elsewhere at that price. Served with grits or bread, it made a breakfast that was filling and nourishing. Salt herring was common in Black communities where preserved fish was cheaper than fresh meat. Children grew up with the smell of frying fish filling the kitchen before dawn. The bones were small and numerous, requiring careful eating, but families learned to navigate them. This breakfast came from a time when preserved foods kept people alive through lean months. Which of these breakfasts did you grow up eating?
Buttermilk hoe cakes were thin, golden cornmeal pancakes that turned an everyday staple into a morning delight. A batter of cornmeal, buttermilk, and a little melted butter was poured onto a hot cast-iron griddle where it spread into crisp-edged rounds. The cakes cooked quickly, developing a toasty aroma that filled the kitchen and tempted everyone to grab one straight from the pan. Served with honey, cane syrup, or a pat of fresh butter, they offered a satisfying balance of tangy buttermilk and sweet corn. Families loved them because they were inexpensive, fast, and endlessly versatile, equally good with fried eggs or a bowl of stewed fruit. Grandparents recall how hoe cakes were often cooked outdoors on flat hoes or griddles over open fires during harvest seasons, a practical method that gave the cakes their name. Each bite carried the taste of tradition and the resourcefulness of cooks who knew how to turn simple ingredients into a breakfast worth remembering. Country ham and red-eye gravy brought a different kind of Christmas flavor, bold, smoky, and unforgettable. Grandparents fried thick slices of ham until the edges crisped, then poured in strong black coffee to make the gravy. The sizzle was sharp, the smell rich and salty with a whisper of bitterness. The gravy was thin, almost see-through, but it carried flavor strong enough to wake the soul. Poured over biscuits or grits, it turned breakfast into something fierce and proud. It was food for people who worked hard, who earned their rest on cold winter mornings. The taste of ham met the bite of coffee in a balance that only tradition could teach. It wasn't sweet or fancy, it was real. Country ham and red-eye gravy reminded everyone that even leftover meat could become something special when cooked with skill and care. It was strength served on a plate. Cracklin cornbread was a dish that brought a little joy and extra nourishment to the table, especially during times of struggle. Made by folding pork cracklings into traditional cornbread batter, it added both protein and crunch to a meal that was usually simple. Pork skins and fat were cheap and rarely wasted, and incorporating them into cornbread gave households a way to make breakfast more sustaining. Served hot from the skillet, Cracklin cornbread was filling enough to carry families through demanding days. It became a staple for marches, farm work, or long hours in factories, offering both flavor and strength. Children remembered the satisfying crunch, while adults valued the resourcefulness that turned scraps into sustenance. Cracklin cornbread reflected a deeper story about resilience, showing how families took pride in making the most of what they had. More than just food, it symbolized unity at the table and fuel for the struggles ahead, keeping spirits alive through its warmth and heartiness. Sweet potato biscuits added a gentle sweetness to the morning, making them a treasured treat for families across the South. Mashed sweet potatoes were folded into soft dough along with a spoonful of cane syrup and a touch of warm spices. As the biscuits baked, the natural sugars caramelized, creating a golden crust and a tender, moist interior. Served warm with butter or a smear of homemade jam, they filled kitchens with a scent that promised a comforting start to the day. Grandparents often saved leftover sweet potatoes from supper just to make these biscuits at dawn, stretching every ingredient while creating something that felt indulgent. Their vibrant color and subtle sweetness brightened even the simplest breakfast plates, pairing well with scrambled eggs or strong black coffee. These biscuits were a perfect example of resourceful cooking that turned farm harvests into something both nourishing and memorable, leaving a flavor that still lingers in family stories and worn recipe cards. Salmon, croquettes, and grits were the Christmas breakfast that made everyone feel rich, even when times were lean. Grandparents opened a can of salmon, mixed it with onions, cornmeal, and a little egg, then shaped it into perfect patties. They fried them in a cast-iron skillet until golden, the edges crisp and crackling. The smell was buttery and bold, filling the air with promise. Served over creamy, slow-cooked grits, the croquettes glistened under a drizzle of hot sauce or melted butter. It was a meal that spoke of care and ingenuity, turning pantry staples into celebration. The first bite melted between salt and comfort, smoky fish meeting the silk of the grits. It was both breakfast and blessing, the kind that stayed in memory long after the plates were cleared. On Christmas morning, it reminded families that joy didn't come from wealth, but from the love stirred into the skillet. Cold cornbread and milk was often called the poor man's cereal, but it was more than a label, it was a lifeline. Day-old cornbread, often too dry to eat on its own, was crumbled into bowls and covered with milk or buttermilk, creating a filling meal that could be eaten quickly before school or work. For children, it was breakfast. For adults, it was sometimes supper, proving its versatility. It carried a tangy, comforting flavor that became familiar in many Southern households. What made it special was not the taste alone, but the reminder that nothing was wasted, not even stale bread. In communities with little to spare, this dish represented survival and practicality. Cold cornbread and milk was part of the rhythm of daily life, a dish that carried generations through hard times and into mornings of determination. Even with its simplicity, it gave people what they needed to keep going during days that demanded courage and endurance. Hot water cornbread cakes were the kind of breakfast that filled kitchens with warmth before the sun even cleared the trees. Cornmeal was mixed with boiling water until it formed a thick batter that could be shaped into small patties by hand. Each cake hissed as it touched the hot skillet, the edges browning to a perfect crisp while the center stayed soft and tender. Families loved these because they required only a few pantry staples, yet tasted like a feast when served with butter or a drizzle of cane syrup. Grandparents remember the sound of sizzling cakes as a gentle morning alarm, calling everyone to the table. These cakes were hearty enough to keep field workers energized through the day and simple enough for children to help prepare. Whether eaten plain or split open to cradle a slice of fried fish from the night before, hot water cornbread cakes proved that true comfort often comes from the simplest ingredients and a steady hand at the skillet. Buttermilk pancakes with sorghum syrup were the taste of Southern Christmas mornings, sweet, warm, and steady. Grandparents stirred batter smooth in a big bowl, the sound of the whisk keeping rhythm with gospel playing low on the radio. The griddle hissed as each ladle of batter hit, spreading into circles that browned just right. When stacked high, the pancakes steamed like soft clouds waiting for the pour. Sorghum syrup, thick and dark, flowed slow over the top, pooling in the edges. Its taste was deep, old-fashioned, with hints of caramel and smoke. Families gathered sleepy-eyed around the table, watching the syrup drip and laughing softly at the morning quiet. Every forkful was sweet and grounding, comfort that didn't need decoration. Pancakes were never just pancakes. They were a small promise of good things ahead, a Christmas tradition that spoke of love more than luxury. Stewed prunes with grits might sound plain today, but it was a dish that kept households nourished and children strong. Prunes were affordable, dried, and easy to store, making them a reliable sweetener when sugar was limited. Simmered until soft and paired with steaming bowls of grits, they turned into a balanced meal of fiber, sweetness, and filling grains. Large families often leaned on this combination because it could stretch far with little cost. For children, stewed prunes made breakfast feel less plain, while adults valued the strength it provided for long workdays. It was also a dish that traveled through generations, passed down as a memory of lean years and perseverance. Families carried bowls of this simple breakfast before marches, school, and shifts, finding strength in the comfort of familiarity. Stewed prunes with grits became a quiet but powerful dish of the Civil Rights era, proving that even the humblest meals could carry dignity and hope. Redeye gravy with country ham was a bold wake-up call that combined salty meat drippings with the sharp bite of black coffee. After thick slices of cured ham were seared in a cast-iron skillet, a splash of hot coffee was poured into the pan to release every bit of smoky flavor. The result was a thin, savory gravy that was spooned over grits or biscuits, adding a punch of flavor that jolted sleepy mornings to life. This dish reflected a no-waste mindset, where nothing from a prized ham went unused. Grandparents remember the rich aroma of coffee mingling with sizzling pork as a smell that meant breakfast was nearly ready. Served alongside eggs or even spooned over rice, Redeye gravy gave working families the hearty start they needed for long days in the fields or factories. It was simple, strong, and unforgettable, a dish that carried the warmth of tradition and the energy of early morning labor. Sweet potato biscuits with molasses were the heart of Christmas mornings, soft, spiced, and full of warmth that felt like family. Grandparents mashed leftover sweet potatoes into flour and lard, mixing with gentle hands that had seen both struggle and celebration. The dough came together smooth and bright, its color glowing like sunrise. When the biscuits baked, the air filled with sweetness and spice, wrapping the house in comfort. Once they came out golden, hot molasses was poured slow, dark as honey and twice as rich. It soaked into every crumb, glistening under the light of the kitchen window. Each bite tasted like joy remembered, soft on the tongue, but heavy with meaning. Families gathered around the table, breaking bread with laughter and gratitude. Sweet potato biscuits were not just breakfast. They were love served warm, proof that even in humble kitchens, the holidays could feel grand. Eggless mayonnaise biscuits were one of those recipes that came out of necessity, but lingered in kitchens long after shortages eased. Families discovered that a spoonful of mayonnaise could stand in for eggs and fat, binding dough into soft, fluffy biscuits without using precious rationed ingredients. During the Civil Rights era, this recipe stuck around because it was practical and affordable, perfect for households where money and supplies were always stretched thin. Mothers could bake a tray in the morning, serving them plain, with syrup, or alongside whatever small scraps were available. Children often carried leftovers in their pockets to school, eating them between lessons for a bit of comfort and energy. The taste was familiar and reliable, even if the origins came from harder times. Eggless mayonnaise biscuits symbolized more than just thrift. They carried the determination to keep families fed through resourcefulness. They became a quiet staple on breakfast tables that fueled long days of work, activism, and resilience. Field pea breakfast stew transformed humble peas into a nourishing start to the day. Fresh or dried field peas were simmered slowly with onions, garlic, and a smoked ham hock until the broth turned rich and flavorful. Served over hot rice, the stew delivered protein and warmth that fueled hours of labor. Families valued it as a way to stretch ingredients while creating a meal that felt hearty and complete. Grandparents remember waking to the scent of peas simmering on the stove, a steady reminder that breakfast was already underway before dawn. The dish brought together garden harvests and cured meat, reflecting a tradition of combining what was fresh with what had been carefully preserved. It was a breakfast that filled bellies and lifted spirits, offering comfort in every spoonful. Today, field pea breakfast stew stands as a delicious tribute to the patience and skill of those who cooked with care and shared their tables with love. Hogmaw and potatoes was a breakfast that carried both weight and flavor for households that needed energy for the day ahead. Hogmaw, or hog stomach, was cleaned carefully, seasoned, and slow-cooked until tender. Potatoes were added to the pot, soaking up the rich broth and spices as they simmered together. The result was a dish that was hearty, savory, and deeply satisfying, often eaten in large portions to provide strength before long hours in the fields or factories. Though not a delicacy, it was respected because it made use of parts of the hog that otherwise might have been discarded. The combination of meat and potatoes provided both protein and comfort, ensuring that families started their mornings with something filling. Hogmaw and potatoes reflected resilience, turning less desirable cuts into meals that carried pride and tradition. Though it is rarely seen on tables today, it once served as a dependable morning staple. Onion and potato hash cakes were one of those breakfasts that always felt hearty, even without meat. Potatoes and onions were grated, mixed with flour or cornmeal, and fried into crisp patties that could be eaten plain or with hot sauce if available. The dish was cheap, easy to prepare, and could stretch across several plates, making it ideal for large households. It was often made in the early mornings before children headed to school or adults to long shifts at work. The taste was simple but filling, a combination of flavors that became closely tied to daily life in tough years. Families leaned on it not only for its thrift, but for the comfort it gave in the face of uncertainty. Onion and potato hash cakes fueled countless mornings of determination, carrying people through struggles outside the kitchen. They became a dish remembered not just for their flavor, but for their role in sustaining courage and community. Molasses pull bread brought a gentle sweetness to early mornings and delighted children who loved to tear off soft, sticky pieces while the loaf was still warm. The yeast dough was enriched with sorghum or blackstrap molasses, giving it a rich color and a deep, caramel-like flavor. After a slow rise, it was baked until the crust turned dark and slightly chewy, while the inside stayed moist and tender. Families treasured this bread because it required little more than patience and a steady hand, yet the reward was a fragrant loaf that could feed many. Grandparents remember how the scent of molasses would drift through the house, promising a breakfast that felt like a celebration even on an ordinary day. Slices were enjoyed plain, toasted or slathered with butter, making every bite a reminder of how sweet life could be when shared at the family table. Molasses pull bread remains a symbol of care and time, proof that the simplest ingredients can create the most lasting memories. Fried apples with cinnamon turned Christmas mornings into something golden and sweet. Grandparents peeled the apples thin, letting them fall into a skillet of melted butter and sugar. The sizzle was gentle, like music in the background of a winter morning. Cinnamon and nutmeg dusted over top filled the room with spice and memory. The apples softened slow, turning syrupy and caramelized, their scent seeping through the house. Served warm beside biscuits, sausage, or pancakes, they brought dessert to breakfast. Each spoonful felt like sunlight after cold nights, simple, shining, and kind. The flavor lingered long after the plate was empty, wrapping the heart in warmth. Fried apples weren't fancy, but they were love in its purest form, the kind passed from pan to pan across generations. Grandparents often saved the syrup from the pan, drizzling it over biscuits so not a drop went to waste. It was a taste of patience and pride, proof that sweetness could always be found even in the simplest kitchens. The smell stayed in the air like a song that never ended, marking every Christmas morning with the same golden glow. Carolina gold rice cakes gave new life to leftover grains and turned yesterday's supper into a crisp morning treat. Cold rice was mixed with a little flour, a pinch of salt, and enough fresh egg to bind it together before being shaped into small patties. Each cake hissed as it met the hot cast iron skillet, forming a golden crust that crackled with every bite. The inside stayed soft and nutty, a reminder of the prized Carolina Gold variety once grown across the coastal South. Families enjoyed these cakes with a drizzle of cane syrup or a spoonful of stewed fruit, creating a breakfast that felt both thrifty and indulgent.
Drop your memories in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more forgotten foods that shaped a generation.